This is the story of the samurai, a warrior class born in blood, bound by honor, and shrouded in myth. Their blades shaped Japan, and their legacy still echoes in silence. Welcome to fall asleep to. If long, gentle journeys through history, philosophy, and the stars bring you comfort, consider subscribing so you'll always have another story waiting. Now get comfortable, let the world grow quiet, and let's get started. Long before the samurai became cultural icons, before their armor gleamed on the battlefields of feudal Japan, or their code of honor was written in ink and blood, there was chaos. Japan in the 8th and 9th centuries was a land of fragmentation. The imperial court, seated in Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto, had long claimed supreme authority. It ruled in the name of divine ancestry, tracing the emperor's bloodline to the sun goddess, Amaterasu herself. Yet in truth, the emperor's grasp on power was more symbolic than absolute. Powerful aristocratic families, most notably the Fujiwara, wielded true control through regency, court politics, and manipulation. Beyond the elegant screens and gardens of Kyoto, however, the countryside was far less orderly. Local landowners and clan chieftains were rising, claiming authority in their own territories. The growing use of private military forces to protect land, enforce law, and settle disputes created an arms race of sorts. The imperial court, increasingly unable to maintain direct rule over distant provinces, began to rely on these local strongmen to govern the land. Thus began the gradual rise of the bushi, armed retainers hired by aristocrats, landowners, and powerful monasteries to act as enforcers. These were not yet samurai in the full, romanticized sense, but they were the raw clay from which the samurai class would be shaped. The etymology of a warrior. The word samurai is derived from the Japanese verb saburao, meaning to serve or to attend upon. These warriors were initially defined not by power or prestige, but by service. They were servants, not to a court, but to a lord. Loyalty, obedience, and duty were their currency. The earliest samurai were frontier warriors, tasked with defending land from bandits, pirates, and rebellious tribes. Many of them came from provincial families, minor nobles who lacked influence at court, but who gained prominence through martial skill and loyalty to a powerful patron. Over time, as the demand for armed retainers grew, so did the prestige of those who commanded them. The Genpei War and the rise of samurai power, a major turning point came in the late 12th century with a conflict that would reshape Japan and elevate the samurai from hired swords to ruling elite. The Genpei War, which raged from 1180 to 1185, was a bloody and dramatic civil war fought between two powerful clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. The Taira had dominated court politics for decades, marrying into the imperial family and consolidating power in Kyoto. But the Minamoto, displaced, exiled, and humiliated, bided their time. When they returned, they did so with swords drawn. This war was more than a clash of armies. It was a war of generations, ideologies, and class. For the first time, power would shift permanently from the courtly elite to the warrior class. Minamoto no Yoritomo emerged as the victor. Rather than seizing the throne, however, he created a new system, the shogunate. He declared himself Sei Taishogun, literally barbarian subduing great general, and established military rule from his base in Kamakura. This marked the birth of Japan's first bakufu, or military government. It was a system where emperors still reigned but no longer ruled. The samurai, once foot soldiers and frontier guards, were now the de facto rulers of Japan. From this moment on, the samurai were no longer merely tools of the aristocracy. They were a class unto themselves, one that would rule, rebel, and redefined Japan for centuries to come. The Kamakura period, rule by the sword. The Kamakura shogunate, 1185 to 1333, marked the first true samurai government. And like any new ruling class, the samurai faced a challenge: how to govern a fractured nation and each other. Samurai loyalty was not abstract. It was deeply personal, forged through bonds of land, blood, and patronage. Samurai served lords in exchange for land or income, often formalized through documents and sealed with oaths. This made their loyalty strong, but also dangerously flexible. If a lord could not reward his vassals, they might turn to someone who could. As such, the Kamakura shogunate quickly developed a bureaucratic system to track land grants and ensure loyalty. Samurai were now part warrior, part landholder, and part administrator. They were expected to uphold the law in the provinces while remaining ever ready for war. But governance alone was not enough to unify a warrior class. Something more was needed. Something spiritual, something ideological. And so, the seeds of bushidō, the way of the warrior, began to take root. The Mongol invasions and the samurai's trial by fire. In the late 13th century, Japan faced a terrifying threat from the outside. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, an emperor of the Mongol Empire, demanded that Japan submit as a vassal. The Kamakura shogunate refused. In retaliation, Mongol fleets launched 2 invasions, in 1274 and again in 1281. These invasions, though ultimately repelled, had a profound impact on the samurai and on Japanese national consciousness. The Mongols fought in tight formations, used advanced siege weapons, and coordinated attacks that baffled the individualistic samurai. Accustomed to ritualized one-on-one combat, Japanese warriors were initially overwhelmed by the Mongol swarm tactics. But nature intervened. In both invasions, typhoons, later dubbed kamikaze, or divine winds, destroyed the Mongol fleets. Japan was saved, but the cost was immense. The shogunate, which had financed massive defensive efforts, had little reward to offer its warriors, since there was no land to confiscate from defeated enemies. This created a crisis. Samurai who had risked their lives expected compensation. When that compensation did not come, discontent grew. The Mongol invasions also changed the samurai psyche. No longer was Japan invulnerable. The idea of a warrior's duty expanded from serving a lord to defending the nation itself. It was a subtle shift, but one that would echo for centuries. To understand the samurai, one must understand bushidō, the way of the warrior. But bushidō was not created in a single moment. It was not written down in a sacred book or etched into stone tablets. It was a slow-burning fire, shaped over centuries by war, poetry, death, and duty. Bushidō was never codified during the early periods of samurai rule. Rather, it was a collection of unwritten expectations, cultural values, and spiritual ideals passed down from master to apprentice, father to son, lord to retainer. It was a moral framework built around loyalty, courage, frugality, martial mastery, and, perhaps most importantly, honor, even in death. For the samurai, to die with honor was preferable to living in shame. Death before dishonor. In the heart of bushidō was a quiet, steady readiness for death. The samurai did not fear death. They rehearsed it. They wrote poetry about it. They meditated upon it. Their philosophy was not built around the preservation of life, but around the graceful and honorable completion of it. This mindset made the samurai uniquely dangerous and deeply respected. It also gave rise to one of the most haunting and misunderstood rituals in samurai culture: seppuku, or ritual suicide. Seppuku was performed to preserve honor in the face of failure, disgrace, or defeat. It was not considered an act of cowardice, but one of supreme courage and control. The ritual was methodical. The samurai would don white robes, kneel upon a mat, and compose a death poem, a final reflection of beauty and thought before passing. Then, using a small blade, he would open his own abdomen. A trusted second, or kaishakonin, would then swiftly decapitate him to end his suffering. It was brutal, it was solemn, and it was beautiful in the uniquely tragic way that only samurai death could be. But bushidō was not only about dying well, it was about living rightly. Zen and the sword, one of the most profound influences on samurai thought, was Zen Buddhism. Zen entered Japan from China in the 12th and 13th centuries, and its emphasis on simplicity, mindfulness, and the acceptance of impermanence resonated deeply with the warrior class. Samurai took to Zen meditation not as monks, but as warriors seeking clarity under pressure. Sitting in zazen, motionless, focused, quiet, they trained their minds for the stillness they would need in battle. The sword and Zen became inseparable. A clean strike was not just a martial act, it was an expression of inner stillness. Swordsmanship became a form of moving meditation, and many samurai believed the perfect cut could only come from a perfectly clear mind. As swords were sharpened, so too were thoughts. It is no accident that some of the most famous swordsmen in Japanese history were also poets, calligraphers, and Zen practitioners, none more so than Miyamoto Musashi, the lone wolf. Miyamoto Musashi was not a typical samurai. Born in the late 16th century, Musashi was a rōnin, a samurai without a master. He fought in over 60 duels, never losing once. But what made Musashi legendary was not just his martial prowess, but his philosophy. He lived simply, wandering the country with little more than 2 swords and his wits. He refused wealth, titles, or comfort. Musashi developed the two heavens style of fighting using both swords simultaneously, and later wrote the Book of 5 Rings, a treatise on swordsmanship and strategy that is still studied by martial artists, business leaders, and philosophers today. Musashi's story is more than one of battle. It is one of balance, of being alone yet unshaken, of holding death close yet walking with quiet confidence. He is often seen as the embodiment of the ideal samurai, disciplined, deadly, and deeply philosophical. His legend grew not from lords or armies, but from silence, practice, and the precision of his blade. The golden age of the samurai. While men like Musashi wandered and duelled, Japan as a whole was transforming. The 16th century was an age of fire and ambition, a time known as the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period. For over a century, Japan was consumed by chaos. Daimyo, powerful warlords, vied for control of the fractured land. Alliances shifted like sand. Castles were built, burned and rebuilt. It was a time of endless battle and endless opportunity for samurai. It was during this period that 3 men would rise, one after the other, to unite Japan. Oda Nobunaga, the ruthless innovator who used firearms and shock tactics to crush his enemies. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the brilliant tactician who rose from peasantry to rule most of Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient strategist who would finally bring peace and establish a dynasty. These men were not merely generals. They were nation builders, and their success marked the end of the freewheeling, chaotic samurai age and the beginning of something new, the Tokugawa shogunate. Peace and its discontents. The Tokugawa era, which began in 1603, brought over 2 centuries of peace to Japan. But peace, while good for society, was deeply confusing for the samurai. For generations, the samurai had been warriors. Now, there were no wars left to fight. With swords sheathed, many samurai took up new roles as bureaucrats, teachers, and officials. Some embraced literature, poetry, and philosophy. Others clung bitterly to their old identity. They still wore their two swords. They still dressed in their traditional garb. But many no longer had battles to fight or causes to die for. This was a spiritual crisis, a slow erosion of purpose. Some samurai adapted, others did not. One of the most vivid reflections of this era's complexity is the story of the 47 rōnin, a tale of loyalty, revenge, and sacrifice that would become the archetype of bushidō itself. In the winter of 1701, inside Edo Castle, the heart of Tokugawa power, a tragedy began that would become the most famous tale in all of samurai lore. The Lord of Ako, Asano Naganori, had been assigned to receive an important imperial envoy. It was a prestigious duty, and he was to be instructed in proper court etiquette by a powerful shogunate official, Kira Yoshinaka. But Kira was not a man of patience or humility. He was arrogant and, according to legend, expected bribes and lavish gifts from those he tutored. Asano, being a man of principle, refused to indulge. Kira's greed. Tensions grew. One day, in a hallway of Edo Castle, after a particularly humiliating encounter, Asano could take no more. He drew his short sword and attacked Kira. Though Kira survived with only a minor wound, the act was unforgivable. Drawing a weapon inside the shogun's castle was a capital offense. That same day, Asano was ordered to commit seppuku. His lands were confiscated, his retainers were cast out, becoming rōnin, masterless samurai, adrift and dishonored. But among those retainers was a man named Oishi Yoshio, Asano's chief counselor. And though the law forbade revenge, the code of Bushido demanded it. Oishi gathered 46 of Asano's loyal followers, and over the course of 2 years, they waited. They disbanded, disguised their intentions. Some took up common jobs. Others lived as drunkards to dispel suspicion. And then, on a cold December night in 1702, they struck. The 47 rōnin stormed Kira's mansion in Edo. They overcame his guards and found the man hiding in a secret courtyard. He was offered the chance to die by seppuku, as was customary. When he refused, they beheaded him and laid his head on Asano's grave. The nation was stunned. The act was illegal, but also honorable. The rōnin had avenged their lord, upheld Bushido, and conducted themselves with perfect discipline, but they had also defied the shogunate's rule of law. After much deliberation, the shogunate rendered its judgment. The rōnin would be ordered to commit seppuku. Each man obeyed. They died not as criminals, but as samurai, loyal to the end. Their graves at Sengakuji Temple became a place of pilgrimage. Their story became legend. Even today, the tale of the 47 rōnin poses questions that echo in every society. Is the law more important than honor? Is loyalty more valuable than life? And what does it mean to serve when service leads to death? The story is not just about revenge. It is about duty, quiet, patient, and unwavering. It is the soul of the samurai. The samurai and the sword. Ask anyone around the world what defines a samurai, and they will almost always give the same answer. The sword. The katana, with its elegant curve and razor edge, is more than a weapon. It is a symbol. But the samurai used many weapons, bows, spears, and later, even firearms. So why did the sword become sacred? Part of the answer lies in the craftsmanship. Forging a katana was an art form. It involved folding steel thousands of times to create a blade that was strong, flexible, and sharp. The process took weeks sometimes, months, and the finished weapon was often considered to contain the very spirit of the samurai who wielded it. The katana was worn edge up, allowing for a faster draw and cut. Samurai trained in aikido, the art of drawing and striking in a single motion, clean, fluid, deadly. But beyond the technique, the sword was seen as a spiritual extension of the samurai's soul. It represented purity, clarity, and justice. In many ways, the sword was a mirror, and when a samurai looked into that mirror, he saw not just steel, but his code, his discipline, and his fate. Decline and fall. The Meiji Restoration. The Tokugawa period lasted over 250 years. It was a time of order, prosperity, and strict social structure. But peace has a cost. As Japan modernized, many began to see the samurai not as protectors, but as relics. The world was changing, and the samurai, with their swords and codes, seemed to belong to a different age. In 1853, American warships led by Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay. Their message was clear: open Japan to the West or face the consequences. The shogunate, ill-prepared to resist, signed treaties that many saw as humiliating. Discontent spread. The emperor, long a figurehead, was restored to true power in 1868 in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. Japan now rushed to modernize, militarily, economically, and culturally, and in this new world, there was no place for the old samurai. In 1876, the wearing of swords was banned. Samurai stipends were abolished. The class system was dismantled. For many samurai, this was a second death. Some adapted, becoming teachers, writers, or industrialists. Others rebelled, as in the case of Saigo Takamori, the last true samurai, who led the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. Armed with swords and tradition, Saigo's forces faced a modern Japanese army with rifles and cannons. They were defeated. Saigo died, some say by seppuku, others say in battle. His legacy lived on. The age of the samurai had ended, but the spirit of the samurai was only beginning to evolve. The fall of the samurai did not mean their disappearance. Even as the swords were banned and the warrior class dissolved, the ideals of the samurai seeped into the roots of modern Japan, quietly but permanently. The Meiji government, though intent on modernizing, did not abandon the samurai legacy entirely. Instead, it reimagined it. Samurai values such as loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice were woven into the fabric of the new imperial army. Military schools adopted bushidō-like codes to inspire devotion and selflessness among soldiers. By the early 20th century, a romanticized version of the samurai had emerged, one that blurred the line between history and mythology. The samurai were now symbols of national pride. Bushido reborn. From feudal code to national ideology. In the early 1900s, as Japan expanded its influence and built its empire, Bushido was redefined once more, not as the personal code of a warrior, but as a national ethos. Writers like Nitobe Inazo helped shape this transformation. His book Bushidō, The Soul of Japan, published in 1899, introduced samurai ethics to Western readers. In it, he described Bushido not as a brutal code, but as a moral and spiritual framework akin to Western chivalry. Nitobe's version of Bushido emphasized virtues like rectitude, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. His work was read not only in Japan but also in Europe and America, contributing to the global fascination with samurai ideals. But in Japan, Bushido also took on a more nationalistic tone. In the lead-up to World War II, Japan's military government invoked the samurai spirit to encourage sacrifice and obedience. soldiers were taught that surrender was shameful, that death in battle was honorable, that, like the samurai, they should serve unto death. This interpretation of Bushido reached its extreme in the use of kamikaze pilots, young men who, in the closing years of the war, flew suicide missions against enemy ships. Their bravery was unquestionable, but their deaths were born from a warped version of samurai ideals. The same divine wind, kamikaze, that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion, now carried young men into flames. This was not the Bushido of poets or monks. It was a weaponized myth, forged in the fires of nationalism. After the war, as Japan rebuilt, it would once again re-examine the meaning of the samurai in pop culture, ink, film, and memory. In the decades that followed World War II, Japan emerged as an economic powerhouse. With peace came reflection, and with reflection came nostalgia. Samurai stories surged in popularity. Writers and filmmakers began to explore the samurai, not just as warriors, but as deeply human figures, tragic, flawed, and philosophical. One name towers above all others: Akira Kurosawa. Kurosawa's films, such as Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, and Harakiri, captured the samurai spirit with both intensity and tenderness. These films didn't glorify violence. They examined justice, loyalty, and the weight of moral choice. The samurai, once fearsome, became sympathetic. Kurosawa's influence spread far beyond Japan. Western filmmakers borrowed heavily from his style. The Magnificent Seven, Star Wars, and even Kill Bill carry his cinematic DNA. The image of the lone warrior, wandering, honorable, and haunted, became universal. At the same time, manga and anime introduced the samurai to younger generations. Characters inspired by Bushido appear in countless stories, from Rurouni Kenshin to Samurai Champloo and beyond. The samurai, it seems, never really left. They just changed forms. What remains, samurai values in Japanese culture. Today, even in modern Japan, echoes of the samurai persist. In business, the emphasis on discipline, endurance, and loyalty is often traced back to samurai ideals. In martial arts like kendo, aikido, and karate, the philosophy of Bushido remains alive in training halls and dojos. Japanese calligraphy, tea ceremonies, and even gardening retain the aesthetic of samurai refinement, precision, patience, and harmony. Tourists flock to ancient castles, to the graves of the 47 rōnin, to Kyoto's temples and Tokyo's museums. Children dress as samurai for festivals. Schools teach the tale of Saigo Takamori and the rise and fall of the samurai age. But perhaps the most powerful trace of the samurai is invisible. It lives in moments of quiet dignity, in the refusal to quit, in the careful bow, the honest handshake, the unspoken promise. The samurai may be gone, but in Japan and in the hearts of those who understand, their spirit endures. While the image of the samurai is almost always male, armor glinting, sword raised, the history of samurai women is just as layered, though often hidden in shadow. These women were not simply wives or mothers. They were guardians of homes, keepers of honor, and, in many cases, warriors in their own right. They were called onabugisha, female warriors trained in the use of weapons to protect their families and land in the absence of men. And while they rarely fought on open battlefields, their courage was undeniable. One of the most iconic was Tomoe Gozen, a warrior of the late 12th century. Her name appears in the Heike Monogatari, a chronicle of the Genpei War. Described as a woman of extraordinary beauty and fearsome skill, she was said to have ridden into battle with a long sword and a bow, cutting down enemies and fighting alongside her male counterparts. Tomoe was not an anomaly. In times of siege or civil war, women in samurai households often took up arms. They learned to wield the naginata, a curved polearm ideal for defending against cavalry and multiple opponents. The weapon became symbolic of female martial prowess, but the role of samurai women extended beyond combat. They were also educators, strategists, and cultural preservers. Within the household, they maintained the values of bushidō, honor, loyalty, and self-discipline. They raised sons to be warriors and daughters to be strong, intelligent stewards of their family legacy. Marriage for a samurai woman was not just romantic, it was political. Alliances between clans were sealed with weddings. A wife's loyalty was to her husband and his clan, even at the cost of her former family. The weight of loyalty for samurai women was just as heavy as it was for men. Their sacrifices were different, but no less profound, and like their male counterparts, they too sometimes chose death over dishonor. There are accounts of women committing ritual suicide, defending their homes to the death, or setting fires to their compounds, rather than letting them fall into enemy hands. Their stories are fewer, but no less meaningful. In remembering them, we see a fuller picture of the samurai world, one in which strength took many forms, and honor was a burden carried by all. Armor and aesthetics. The beauty of battle. Samurai were not just warriors, they were aesthetes. To the outsider, their world may appear brutal and violent, but within that violence was an obsession with beauty, reflected in their armor, their art, and even the way they wrote about death. Samurai armor, or yoroi, was not only practical, it was symbolic. Crafted from iron plates, lacquered leather, and silk cords, it protected without sacrificing mobility. The lamella design allowed for flexibility, and the armor's surface often bore family crests, mystical symbols, or scenes from nature. Helmets, or kabuto, were marvels of both engineering and creativity. Some were adorned with fearsome horns or crests to intimidate foes. Others bore Buddhist symbols, dragon motifs, or even humorous flourishes, reminders of the complex personalities behind the mask. And beneath the armor, many samurai wore beautifully patterned garments, hitatare and kimono, aesthetic even in preparation for battle. When they were not at war, samurai often engaged in chanoyu, the tea ceremony, a ritual of stillness and precision. They practiced ikebana, flower arranging, shodo, calligraphy, and haiku, poetry. These were not mere hobbies. They were expressions of balance, the sword in one hand, the brush in the other. The famed samurai and tea. Master Sen no Rikyu once said that true mastery came from the harmony of simplicity and depth. This was as true for the way of tea as it was for the way of war. The ideal samurai was not only skilled in battle, but refined in thought. He could take a life with grace, or describe the falling of a cherry blossom in a poem. This balance of destruction and beauty defined the samurai soul. Samurai clans, families of war. Samurai did not live in isolation. They were part of vast, interwoven clan networks that defined politics, war, and culture in feudal Japan. Clans like the Minamoto, Taira, Hojo, Takeda, Uesugi, and Oda each had their own legends, rivalries, and dynastic ambitions. Some were known for military strength, others for cultural contributions. Their crests, mon, were emblazoned on banners, armor, and even architecture. These clans were the engines of samurai history. Take the Takeda clan, for example, led by Takeda Shingen, one of the most brilliant military minds of the Sengoku era. His strategy, speed, and innovation earned him the nickname, the Tiger of Kai. His red cavalry banners, adorned with Buddhist scripture, struck fear into enemies and awe into allies. Or the Oda clan, under the command of Oda Nobunaga, whose ambition, ruthlessness, and adoption of Western firearms shattered the old world of feudal alliances. These clans often lived and died by the blade. Alliances were temporary. Betrayals were common. Entire families could rise or fall within a generation. But even as they battled, they shared a common identity: samurai. Their loyalty to their clan was absolute, and for many, the name they carried was more valuable than their life. While wars and politics defined the larger arcs of samurai history, the duel, two warriors facing each other in silent judgment, was the purest expression of samurai identity. Samurai duels were not casual encounters. They were events charged with ritual, intention, and meaning. A duel was not always to the death, but it always carried the weight of life. At its core was not hatred, but honor. A famous example is the duel between Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro, two of the most skilled swordsmen of the early Edo period. Kojiro was known for his elegant and deadly technique, particularly his signature strike, the swallow cut. He was charismatic, refined, and supremely confident. Musashi, by contrast, was rougher, less concerned with appearances, more attuned to strategy and adaptability. When the duel was arranged, Musashi intentionally arrived late. Some say it was to unnerve Kojiro. Others believe it was to let the tide come in, narrowing the beach where they would fight. Musashi arrived with a wooden sword he had carved from an oar. In moments, it was over. Musashi struck first, delivering a fatal blow with his makeshift weapon. The duel was not just a victory of skill, it was a victory of psychological warfare, timing, and improvisation. Musashi would go on to retire from dueling and write the Book of Five Rings, reflecting on his battles not as violence, but as a form of self-discipline. The duel, in this light, becomes a metaphor: two lives, one moment, no second chances. And in that moment, clarity, ghosts in the bamboo, the supernatural. Samurai history is filled with facts, but its mythology is filled with ghosts. For centuries, Japanese folklore has been rich with tales of samurai spirits, yurai, who could not rest, often returning to fulfill unkept oaths, avenge betrayals, or guard sacred places. One such legend is that of Taira no Masakado, a rebellious samurai of the 10th century who defied the imperial court and declared himself ruler of an eastern province. He was eventually killed and beheaded, but his spirit was feared for centuries. In fact, his grave in Tokyo is still maintained out of respect or fear by local businesses and government buildings. In another tale, a samurai returning from war encounters a pale woman in the forest. She leads him astray, and he vanishes, his sword found resting beside a stone lantern. Was it a ghost, a trickster spirit, or the samurai's own exhaustion made manifest? These stories were not just entertainment, they were warnings, reminders of the weight of oaths, the consequences of broken loyalty, and the ever-present reach of death. Even today, you'll find shrines, statues and legends in rural Japan that speak of the samurai long after they've vanished from the world of the living. The samurai abroad, crossing oceans and borders. Though we often think of samurai as bound to Japan, there were moments, brief and curious, when samurai ventured into the wider world. In 1613, a samurai named Hasekura Tsunenaga embarked on a diplomatic mission across the Pacific Ocean. He was sent by Data Masamune, a powerful daimyo, to establish trade and diplomatic ties with the Vatican and the Spanish crown. Hasekura and his entourage sailed from Japan to Mexico, crossed the Atlantic, and visited Spain and Rome. Dressed in samurai attire, he became one of the first Japanese emissaries to be received by a European monarch. Portraits were painted, gifts exchanged, And yet, his mission ultimately failed. Japan would soon close its borders for over 2 centuries during the Sakoku, closed country period. Still, the sight of a samurai walking through the streets of 17th century Seville or entering St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is a reminder that history is never as confined as it seems. Samurai may have been born of Japanese soil, but their image and their intrigue crossed oceans. The quiet end, the sword becomes symbol. By the late 1800s, Japan had entered the modern age. Railroads crossed the land once patrolled by mounted warriors. Steamships replaced war horses. The emperor wore Western uniforms. And the sword, once a badge of class, was now ceremonial. The Haitore Edict of 1876 officially banned the wearing of swords by anyone outside the military or police. It was the final stroke in the disbandment of the samurai class. For many, it was a time of sorrow. Old family swords were hidden, sold, or passed down quietly as heirlooms. Temples and shrines became keepers of samurai relics. And in some remote areas, small schools of traditional swordsmanship continued in secret. But even as the sword vanished from the streets, it remained in the heart. Because by then, the samurai was no longer just a warrior. He had become an idea, an archetype, a legend. By the time the last sword was sheathed and the final banner lowered, the samurai had already become more than a historical reality. They had become a psychological presence. In the centuries that followed their decline, scholars, poets, and thinkers began to ask, what was it about the samurai that resonated so deeply with people, not only in Japan, but across the world? The answer lies partly in the samurai's relationship to identity. Unlike other warriors, the samurai was defined as much by restraint as by aggression. The ideal samurai did not simply win battles. He embodied control, balance, and intention. His sword was a tool, but never his master. That's why samurai stories don't just linger in museums. They appear in parables, in leadership seminars, in ethical debates. Samurai philosophy touches on something universal, the tension between strength and gentleness, between duty and desire, between life and death. This duality is especially evident in the writings of samurai thinkers like Yamamoto Tsunetomo, author of Hagakure. Hagakure, often translated as Hidden Leaves, is a collection of reflections on the samurai life, written during a time when the warrior class was fading. Tsunetomo argued that the way of the samurai was found in death, not in morbidity, but in the readiness to give up everything for one's duty. To modern readers, Hagakure can feel extreme. But within its sharp edges lie soft truths. Discipline is peace. Courage is not noise, but stillness. And honor is not pride, but sacrifice. In many ways, the samurai mirrors the human struggle itself, the quest to live meaningfully, to hold to principle, and to die without regret. Symbols that speak. The lingering aesthetic. You can still see the samurai everywhere in Japan, not as men in armor, but in symbols. The cherry blossom, or sakura for instance, has long been associated with the samurai. It blooms brilliantly, then falls swiftly, just as a warrior's life might be short, but radiant with purpose. The samurai crest, or mon, still appears on family emblems, temple walls, and traditional clothing. Even the act of bowing, a daily part of Japanese etiquette, carries echoes of the old warrior's respect. It is an act of humility and vigilance, just as a samurai might bow before drawing a blade. Cultural rituals from archery to flower arranging carry subtle nods to samurai discipline, precision, attention to detail, silence, all were part of the warrior's path. In this way, the samurai live on, not as ghosts, but as habits, as gestures, as echoes. The samurai in you. As you lay here, eyes closed, mind adrift, you might be wondering, What does the story of the samurai have to do with me? You are not in feudal Japan. You don't carry a sword. You have no master. But perhaps that's the secret. The way of the samurai was never only about blades or battles. It was about the human condition, about how to act when no one is watching, how to speak when silence is easier, how to walk the narrow line between fear and courage. In your world, the battles are different, but the questions are the same. What do you stand for? What do you protect? How do you live with grace and face the end without shame? In these questions, the samurai are not just history, they are possibility. They are you when you choose to live with purpose, when you choose to serve something higher than yourself, whether that be love, honor, truth, or peace. The wind blows softly through the bamboo. The sword is quiet now. The story has ended. And you are free to rest. Although the age of the samurai officially ended in the 19th century, the techniques, traditions, and teachings of samurai martial arts were never fully extinguished. Hidden in the quiet corners of Japan, in dojos passed down from generation to generation, ancient warrior schools known as Koryu Bujutsu still survive. These schools preserve pre-modern martial systems developed for the battlefield. Unlike modern martial arts, which are often geared towards self-improvement or competition, Koryu arts were designed for war. Each strike, each stance, each movement was meant to kill or protect with purpose and precision. Among these arts are Kenjutsu, the art of the sword, Iaijutsu, the art of drawing the sword and striking in one fluid motion, Naginata Jutsu, the use of the Naginata polearm Kyujutsu, the ancient practice of archery Jujutsu, unarmed techniques for grappling, throwing, and joint locks. These systems were often kept secret, passed only to trusted students who had proven themselves worthy, spiritually as well as physically. One of the most respected surviving schools is Katori Shinto-ryu, which traces its origins to the 15th century. It emphasizes not only combat, but also spiritual development and deep ritual, including invocations to Shinto deities before training. Training in these traditions is not about violence. It is about preservation of history, of movement, of a mindset. To train in these arts is to step into a stream that has been flowing for 500 years. Each kata, or form, is a whisper from the past, a message from warriors long gone. In this way, the samurai still breathe through the disciplined movements of modern martial artists, the hidden samurai, peasants, merchants, and the lines that blurred. Though samurai were legally defined as a social class, the reality of life in feudal Japan was more fluid than strict divisions suggest. There were peasants who fought like samurai, especially during uprisings or when they were conscripted into local militias. There were merchants who bought their way into samurai ranks, especially in the later Edo period, when wealth began to eclipse bloodline. And there were samurai who lived in poverty, reduced to simple labor, struggling to maintain their dignity in a world that had moved on from war. One such figure was Yamamoto Kansuke, a brilliant strategist who was born into obscurity and physical disability, yet rose to become the chief tactician for Takeda Shingen. Another was Oka Tadasuke, a magistrate known for wisdom and fairness, who applied samurai principles not on the battlefield, but in court. Their stories remind us that samurai identity was not always about birth. It was about behavior, mindset, and action. The sword alone did not make the samurai. The choices did. Though the samurai are rooted in Japanese soil, their story has long since crossed oceans, languages, and cultures. In many ways, the image of the samurai has become a global symbol, not just of ancient Japan, but of honor, mystique, and discipline. By the 20th century, Western fascination with the samurai had reached new heights. The writings of Nitobe Inazo and films by Akira Kurosawa were just the beginning. Hollywood soon took note. Samurai archetypes began appearing in everything from cowboy westerns to space operas. George Lucas, creator of Star Wars, openly cited Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress as a foundational influence. Obi-Wan Kenobi's robes, his quiet wisdom, his sword that glows, it all echoes the samurai's stillness and the katana's deadly promise. Later, films like The Last Samurai, 2003, brought the aesthetic and tragedy of the fading warrior class to mainstream audiences. While romanticized, such portrayals reflect a deeper cultural yearning for codes of meaning in a chaotic world. In literature, the samurai's internal conflict, duty versus desire, tradition versus change, resonates deeply with readers in every culture. And in the digital age, video games and anime have created new generations of samurai admirers. Titles like Ghost of Tsushima invite players to walk in the sandals of a warrior torn between honor and necessity, poetry and violence. These retellings are not always historically precise, but they speak to a truth deeper than dates or names, that the samurai spirit touches something timeless within us, something that longs for clarity and moral ambiguity, something that yearns for grace under pressure, something that seeks, even now, to walk a path with honor. The personal path, finding your own code. If bushidō was once a guide for warriors, could it be a guide for us? Modern life is not a battlefield in the traditional sense, but it is full of challenges, choices, moments when courage matters more than comfort. You do not need armor to live with purpose. You do not need a sword to cut away falsehood. You do not need a master to dedicate your life to something greater than yourself. The essence of the samurai is not about death. It is about clarity. It is about looking inward and asking again and again, what do I serve? What do I protect? What will I not betray? In a world that often values speed over depth, noise over silence, convenience over principle, the samurai remind us that stillness is strength, that discipline is liberation, that a well-lived life is a kind of quiet swordplay, elegant, deliberate, and true.